All right. Then I'm going to go on mute, and John, take it away.
Okay, let me make sure I can share my screen here. Yes. Okay, let's present. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the budget for California for this year, including um, the basically what is the budget setting process, how is that process influenced, and then what's in the budget that's been proposed for this year by Governor Newsom. So these are the kind of the big three questions that we're going to be looking at. And so we were going to just do a quick rundown of kind of what is the budget in general, what is the general process by which it moves forward, and then move into the timeline and ways to influence the budget setting process. And then lastly, we'll be kind of doing a little bit of a deeper dive into what is in the current budget proposal, what has been the response from the legislature, and then what is likely to be coming down the pipeline soon. So um, the major points of the budget are obviously, it's the state's spending plan, and it reflects the values and priorities of the current administration. And then, once it goes through the legislature, then it also will reflect the priorities of the legislature. It's made up of state and federal funds, and those state funds comprise general funds, special funds, and bond funds. So there's kind of the big four components. The process is set by the California Constitution and it has been shaped by court decisions, excuse me, and voter propositions, some of which we'll be talking about in just a minute. Um, the budget, kind of the general process is that the governor's office releases a budget proposal in January, and then they do a what's known as a May revise or a May revision to kind of be more up to date once, because the original one comes out in January, and then things change between January and May, and then it goes through the legislature, has to be passed by both houses, and then is signed by the governor. And then just some important points. The governor has what are called blue pencil powers. Once the legislative budget bill goes through the legislature, then once it gets to the governor's desk, then he can reduce or eliminate any appropriation that's in there. So that's a pretty important point. Although the legislature can veto those reductions or eliminations by a 2/3 majority vote. And then the budget bill is a priority bill, so it takes effect immediately upon signing. So there's no you don't have to wait until January 1st, 2022 or anything like that. A little bit more of the details. So once the governor's proposal is put forth or is released, then two separate identical budget bills move through the Senate and the Assembly, and they divide the budget bills up by subject and distribute it out to one of several subcommittees within the Senate or Assembly budget committees. And those subcommittee hearings, because they go into a lot more detail about what's in the different subjects of the budget, that's often where public comment can be most influential, as well as direct outreach to the elected officials, the legislatures that sit on those subcommittees. And then after they move through those subcommittees, then they go to the House floors where they're amended, and then the bills are sent to a joint budget conference committee that is made up of members from each of the houses. So right now the current budget bills, the numbers are SB 112, authored by Skinner, and AB 214, authored by Ting. They were introduced in January after the governor's proposal was released, but they haven't done any. They basically were assigned to their committees, and then there's been no further activity since then. The Legislative Analyst's Office releases several reviews of the budget proposals, including deeper dives into specific subject areas of those budget proposals, and those reviews basically make recommendations and provide general overviews to the legislature, and then so often what the legislature does once the bills are going through the committees, that will often be based on those reviews. And then if there's just lastly, if there's any other statutory changes that are needed to pass or implement the budget, those are done in companion bills that are known as trailer bills because they follow along behind the budget bill. So this is just a little graphic that I put together on the timeline of the budget setting process. So January 10th, the governor's budget proposal comes out, and then it gets introduced into two identical bills that are sent to the Senate and the Assembly committees on budget. And then those are broken up by subject area in the different subcommittees in the Senate and the Assembly. And then somewhere in the middle of there, the governor's May revision comes out. And then it goes through the committees once again, and then comes out to the Senate and Assembly floor for a vote after passing through the Joint Budget Conference Committee. And then once the Senate and Assembly bills are reconciled with each other and amended, and everything is all groovy between the two, then it goes to the governor's office, and then he will sign it or make any changes with the blue pencil powers that he has. And if that is the case, then it will go back to the Senate and Assembly to be voted on again before being signed. And so some important dates here: the May revision comes out on May 14th, and then the Senate and the House both have to pass their budget bills by June 15th, and then the governor has to sign it by July 1st. So basically, that happens June 30th. So it's all coming up pretty quickly here now. In terms of influencing the budget setting process, like I mentioned, the budget subcommittee hearings are often the best place for public input on specific components of each of the budget bills. And then there's a total of 11 subcommittees, 5 in the Senate and 6 in the Assembly, and I've got them listed out here. They meet multiple times per month between February and June and hold workshops and things like that the public can participate in and comment on. In addition to those subcommittee workshops, state agency workshops and regulatory proceedings can also be avenues for the public to influence specific items on the budget. For example, the Just Transition Workshop series that the Office of Planning and Research, OPR, was holding, which just concluded late last month, produced a Just Transition Roadmap report, and that roadmap report went into the considerations behind the governor's original proposal. And in addition, the OPR's Technical Advisory Council holds quarterly meetings, just ongoing, where the public can provide comments. There's a meeting coming up on June 11th that will cover state adaptation strategies, climate insurance, wildfire resilience, and more issues that are of relevance to our work. If anyone is interested in either attending those or interested in a report back, if like I attend or something like that. There's also ongoing regulatory proceedings through the Public Utilities Commission and the Air Resources Board that influence agency budget requests and expenditures. Like, for example, the CARB scoping plan update that will result in CARB basically coming out with a budget request to the governor and to the legislature, as well as the Public Utilities Commission. They through their regulatory proceedings, they set priorities for their agency, and those also go into determining what their budget requests are. In terms of influential propositions for the budget, there's many of them. I'm just going to, instead of reading all of these, I'm just going to focus on these 3 that are the most kind of important for especially this year's budget. But that's Prop 4, which established what's known as the GAN, or State Appropriations Limit. And that basically limits government spending from tax revenues and requires the state to reimburse local governments for complying with state mandates. And so what the effect that this has is basically the state can only collect so much in tax revenue without having to apply a certain proportion of that tax revenue, or once it passes a limit, it has to apply everything past that limit to certain predetermined spending or expenditures, namely education and like specific, K through 12, and then some community college education funding, as well as direct tax rebates. And so we've this year, and I'll talk more about this in a minute, but this year we've definitely far surpassed that state appropriations limit. So a big chunk of the expenditures for this year are going straight to education, as well as to the governor's what he's calling his Golden State Stimulus Plan, which is basically a $500 or $600 direct check to Californians making under, I believe, $75,000 a year. The other another influential proposition was Prop 98 in 1988, and that provides a minimum funding guarantee for school districts and community colleges. And so that basically constrains a big portion of the budget to require it to be spent on school districts and community colleges. And so that also goes back and ties into Prop 4 or the GAN limit. And then Prop 26 requires a 2/3 majority vote for the passage of certain state fees and taxes that do not increase revenue. So this really comes into play for bills that are seeking to influence or increase taxes, or things that can be argued to be taxes, and basically makes it very difficult for them to pass the legislature. So it puts up a big roadblock for budget items in the budget bills that may be seen as increasing taxes and fees without directly increasing state revenue. I'm not going to go over the original January budget proposal, just for the sake of time and for the sake that a lot of it has changed and is no longer relevant. But I am going to just quickly go through what is in the May revision and how it's different from what the governor originally proposed. So the total basically funding available, total resources available is a record-setting $267.8 billion, which is the largest budget in California state history, so pretty significant. And basically all of that has been allocated to expenditures by the governor's proposal. He's proposing to put basically a hefty chunk of that into state reserves, like the public school system stabilization account, the safety net reserve, the budget stabilization account, et cetera. And so the total, his total state reserve proposal is $24.4 billion. And then I mentioned that that GAN, or state appropriations SAL limit, will be exceeded by an estimated $16.2 billion, and that surplus will be split between direct tax refunds through the Golden State Stimulus Plan, as well as K through 12 education funding. So this is a little pie chart that I put together on what those expenditures are by sector, just to give an idea of the relative proportion. So the biggest chunk right now is going to health and human services, which is not totally surprising considering that we're in the midst of a pandemic. It's also usually one of the bigger budget items anyway. The next one is the K through 12 education slice, and that gets back to that state appropriations limit. Basically, a bunch of extra money is going into that fund this year because we had such a record-setting tax revenue year. Other important sectors that we're going to be covering are transportation, natural resources, environmental protection, and labor and workforce development, as well as some business, housing, and consumer components. In terms of what has changed between the January initial proposed budget and the May revise, the January proposed budget was projecting a deficit of $54 billion, whereas the May revise actually has a surplus of $75 billion. And it's increased the spending, the projected spending, from $227 billion to $267 billion, $268 billion. In addition, federal government relief funds to the tune of $27 billion were approved in March, so those have gone into the May revise. And just between, in the last 6 months between now and January, California tax revenues really spiked and were much higher than predicted due to a very small or even a beneficial financial impact of the pandemic on California's highest earners. Folks like Elon Musk and whoever, not that they pay a lot in taxes anyway, but there's other very wealthy Californians that made a killing off of the stock market, and had to pay taxes on that. So it's been really bad for the low income workers, but really, really great for the really rich people. So that's awesome. We love to see that. Um, in terms of specific sector changes, transportation sector got quite a bit of additional funding in the May revise. Natural resources went up by about $4 billion. Environmental protection went up by $2 billion. So just a lot more funding has been allocated to some really important sectors. Diving into the specific sectors that are kind of most relevant for us, starting with climate. It's a total of $11.8 billion that they're predicting to be spent over the next several years. Kind of the biggest components of that are $5 billion for a water resilience package, $1.3 billion for a climate resilience package, which includes things like the preserving 30% of the state public lands by 2030, which I think was a bill that got cut or did not pass, but it's come back in the budget, and so there's funding to be allocated to that, as well as to things like community heat resilience centers, planning and mitigation for sea level rise, community resilience measures like the Transformative Climate Community Program, and a fifth state climate assessment. There's also almost $1 billion allocated to accelerate progress on the state's clean energy goals, like resources and transmission planning, long duration energy storage, energy efficiency, and then some significant investments in offshore wind. I think California is really on the cusp of becoming. Especially in over the last year, there's been major progress in making California a major player in the national offshore wind industry. So that's really exciting. Basically, a brand new green industry that is very high skilled, lots of opportunity for labor and union participation and things like that. So exciting to see that get a good chunk of funding here. And then almost $800 million for sustainable agriculture, which is really great. And they're really trying to focus on climate smart agriculture, what they're calling high road job growth, which is basically the state's kind of political way of saying a just transition without saying a just transition, and then healthy, resilient, and equitable food systems. So water resilience, sustainable ag, climate resilience, clean energy, almost $12 billion over the next few years. It's definitely the most significant climate budget I think that California has ever put forward. Emergency response and preparedness. This is really important because of things like sea level rise, but I think most kind of obviously is a wildfire. 2 years ago, the wildfires really took up all the oxygen in the room, no pun intended, in the legislature, and so I think it's really good that there's almost $1.2 billion being allocated for wildfire mitigation, just directly in the emergency response preparedness, as well as kind of spread through other budget items. But just kind of quickly going through these, $350 million to expand the Office of Emergency Services. So really expanding the staffing and the scope of the office of that office. $30 million to establish a new Office of Equity, focused on emergency response, recovery, and preparedness. So making sure that vulnerable communities who may have been historically discriminated against are not being left out of the state's emergency preparedness planning. That's good. New office, love to see it. $163 million to the California Disaster Assistance Act funding, $250 million to develop a new Prepare California initiative to build disaster resilient communities. And then $150 million toward developing community resilience centers. And so some of these things, like the Office of Equity and the community resilience centers, are actually ideas that are currently making their way through the legislature in a couple bills. Like SB 17 would establish the Office of Racial Equity, that would basically overlap a lot with this new Office of Equity. So it's good to see that the governor is putting forth money that can help support some of these really important environmental justice bills that are going through the legislature right now. For natural resources and environmental protection, I've kind of lumped these together because they're pretty similar. There's a total of $11.4 billion allocated for natural resources and almost $9 billion for environmental protection. Highlights from the natural resources budget, there's a whole laundry list of stuff, but just kind of some of the top level stuff is improved outdoor education, expanding outdoor access, so increasing access to parks and things like that. Enhancing and restoring the state park system. I was happy to see that because Big Basin burned down the other year, and that I grew up going to there, and everything's gone, and I'm happy to see that there's a good chunk of change that will be going to help rebuild that. There's a proposal for funding for the Indian for a new Indian Heritage Center. Not thrilled that they're calling it the Indian Heritage Center, but hey, at least it's a kind of a step in the right direction, I guess. And then endangered species protection, just all across the state. For environmental protection, there's a big focus on the cleanup of contaminated sites, and that also includes abandoned oil and gas well remediation. So that's important from an environmental justice perspective. A lot of those abandoned oil and gas wells are located in or near environmental justice communities, and once the companies, the oil companies that have made those wells, get their money, they usually declare bankruptcy, so they don't have to pay anything forward for future well remediation. So it's good that the state is stepping up here and doing that. There's also an idea for a pesticide notification network. So this would be, helping to notify communities and individuals around areas where they're applying pesticides. Like what are those pesticides? How do we avoid it? What are the health impacts? So that's good to see as well. And then multiple investments into creating a circular economy in California. So ramping up our recycling and composting capabilities, as well as food recovery and organic waste. So all good things here. For transportation, there's a total of 29 billion allocated toward transportation over the next several years. Unfortunately, 4.2 billion of that is going to the darn high-speed rail project that just keeps sucking up a huge amount of state funds and not really producing anything of value. But there's also $1 billion toward priority transit and rail projects, as well as $500 million going toward active transportation. That is, any method of transportation that does not use a motor. So, biking, walking, scootering, et cetera, et cetera. $2 billion toward road and bridge improvements, and then basically $2 billion toward zero emission rail, transit, and buses and trucks, and then $1.5 billion toward litter removal and community beautification. So that's things like paying artists to paint murals in their towns. Really investing in local beautification projects. So that's exciting to see as well. Labor and workforce development, there's just a bit over $1 billion total for that. And there's $750 million for the Community Economic Resilience Fund to advance the governor's Just Transition Roadmap. So that was that roadmap that I was mentioning earlier. And so if that would have been one way for us to influence that process in this budget item potentially. $160 million for employment training and apprenticeships. So, helping to expand union participation in the state. That's great. $157 million to foster increased cooperation between workforce programs and the California community colleges. And as a California community college graduate, I think that's really fantastic. And I think, they could potentially pump a lot more money into that and see some really good results. And then I think this is the last bit on specific subjects here. But for housing and homelessness, there's a total of $12 billion over the next 2 years, with the biggest chunk, $9.3 billion, just in the next fiscal year. So as I'm sure everyone here is aware, Governor Newsom has declared an emergency on homelessness in California, and has really sunk a lot of money and effort into getting people off the streets through his Project Room Key and Project Home Key initiatives. So he's expanding those $3.5 billion to purchase and basically refurbish motels, hotels, and other housing units to turn them into permanent housing through the Home Key Initiative, $1 billion for the CalWorks Housing Support Program, $560 million to address family homelessness, and $250 million for veteran homelessness. And then just a little bit to transition any folks who are still staying in motels through the Project Room Key into permanent housing through the Home Key program. So, this is, I think it's really good that, they're prioritizing, immediately converting unused building spaces into housing permanently. That's, I think it's a really good way to approach it, not like, just building market rate housing and just hoping for the best like we're doing here in Santa Cruz. As I mentioned, the Legislative Analyst Office does in-depth reviews of the budget sector by sector and provides recommendations to the legislature for the budget bills. And I read through all of the analysis, and basically the high-level takeaways is that the LAO basically believes that the governor's office is really overestimating future state revenue and failing to provide some key budget safeguards, like putting more money than he's got allocated currently into reserves, and they're calling it a major risk. So I think that's going to be something that is, high on the list of priorities for the legislature as they review the May revision and vote and make amendments to the budget bills. And so I'll mention in the next slide, kind of what the legislature's response has been to this report. But basically, the Legislative Analyst Office is saying that the governor's office is not properly taking into account revenue decreases that. Well, basically, they're saying that he's been way too optimistic in future years projections for state revenue. But the LAO has been historically very conservative when it comes to predicting future state revenue. So I think there's arguments on both sides. Their general recommendations are to reduce overall spending and send more to the state reserves. I mentioned in an earlier slide, Newsom's got something like 24.4 billion currently allocated to state reserves in his May revise, but they're basically saying that's not enough and that needs to be more. And they also want to spread out the investments that the governor has proposed over longer periods of time to basically slow down the rate of spending. And because right now a significant chunk, I think something like 60% of the funds that the governor is proposing in his May revised are one-time funding expenditures. So not something that's ongoing, but just like we got a problem to fix. We have a bunch of money. We're just going to throw it at it right now, and hope to fix it, rather than setting out a plan to do smaller chunks of payments over longer periods of time. They also recommend to make funding expenditures contingent on future legislation. So, saying, okay, we're going to set aside this chunk of funds, potentially for this project or for this proposal, but the legislature is going to have to pass a bill that says, specifically, we're going to tap into this fund that was set aside by the budget. If they don't pass it, then that the funding will go back into the general fund or wherever it came from. And they're also they kind of snuck this in at the end. They recommend the legislature reject most of the governor's proposals in order to make the budget break even. So they're basically saying the governor is proposing to spend way too much right now, and I think we have an idea of politically why Newsom is doing that with the recall. Just sending out $600 checks to everyone, pumping in billions and billions of dollars of funds into direct public benefit programs. That's basically to make him more popular and make it more likely that he will make it through the recall. But this is kind of unprecedented for a Democratic governor, and I think that the majority Democrat legislature might be a little more conservative leaning in their spending for this, especially if the LAO is proposing that they reject basically everything that the governor's proposing. The legislature has also recently released a report detailing their own priorities and recommendations that's separate from the LAO report. This came out of the budget committee's the Assembly and the Senate. So this is just it's just priorities and recommendations. It's not law. It still needs to be voted on and approved in the budget setting process in the legislature. But basically, what they're saying is they would like to actually increase, go along with the LAO recommendations to increase funding for state reserves and to pay down debts. And that was something, the debt payment was actually something that came directly from John Laird. He was saying, I was on this budget committee during the last recession, and we have an opportunity now to pay down debts to avoid future recessions. And so it seems like that's something that they're likely going to do. They also are recommending to approve the governor's Golden State stimulus and small relief / nonprofit relief plans. And they're actually proposing to significantly increase funding for the wildfire and climate resilience packages. And if the climate resilience package is almost being, they're proposing to almost double it by basically $2.4 billion. And then additionally, an extra $8.5 billion toward homelessness over 2 years, and then significantly $1 billion in ongoing funding. So like I said, most of the funding that's proposed for this coming year is a one-time expenditure, but this $1 billion would be ongoing funding to local governments for projects that help alleviate homelessness in the area. And so just looking ahead, well, I forgot to change this. This is supposed to say June 9th today, but that was from last week. But basically, we're at the point where the governor's mayor revision is out. The legislature has had some time to review it, and the Joint Budget Conference Committee, which is that the committee that's made of both representatives from both the Senate and the Assembly, they started meeting or they convened in May, but they have not had any other meetings since then. So, and they haven't released a schedule of when they're going to be meeting. So that's something that I'm monitoring and can update folks when they release their schedule. But basically, it's going to it's going to continue to be reviewed in the subcommittees, which they're doing now, and will go to the floor of the Senate and the Assembly, and then go to the Budget Committee or the Joint Committee, and then back to the Senate and the floor for final votes if there's any amendments done, and then we'll go to the governor to sign by July 1st. So we're coming up on the last month and a half of this budget setting process, and really the big things that are happening right now are the subcommittee meetings, and then I think soon the Joint Budget Conference Committee will be meeting, and then deciding any final amendments that will happen. Yeah, as I mentioned, the Joint Legislative Budget Committee convened in May, but there's been no meetings since then, and there's no schedule released. And then here's just a list of everyone that is on that committee. I think Laird pops out for us and Santa Cruz, but there's other folks as well that are important to talk about. You'll notice that Nancy Skinner and Philip Ting, who are the chairs of the chair and vice chair of the committee, are the authors of the Senate and Assembly budget bills. And then so that's basically it. I just wanted to review kind of those key questions that I proposed at the top of the presentation. First, what is in the governor's proposed budget? There's really unprecedented funding for sustainability, resiliency, environmental justice, and infrastructure. And then just to review, there's $12 billion for climate funding, $11.4 billion for natural resources, environmental protection, emergency response funding, housing and transportation, and labor. So things all across the board that are really positive. The budget setting process, the governor issues proposals that are amended and voted on by the Senate and the Assembly in the first half of the calendar year. And then in terms of influencing the budget process, that happens through the budget subcommittee meetings and workshops, regulatory proceedings, and by lobbying state legislators directly. And that wraps it up. So I'd be happy to take any questions now. Yeah.
Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Lori, Eliana, do either of you have any questions?
Just a couple of items that popped up that I thought would be helpful to share is that we have been successful in getting several budget requests approved by the legislature this year. And one of the things that really, really helped a lot was just setting up all these meetings in advance with the analysts for those different budget subcommittees. And getting it on their radar and working with them to find creative ways to get things through, especially when you're facing a 2/3 vote, which one of our requests did face that. And so we actually amended our bill to get it past that requirement, and still ended up getting the money in the budget because we found that we had some allies to get it through. I think that was pretty much it. I know you're still recording this for Danny and Sarah, and so I thought it would be helpful to add that. But that's it.
Thank you.
I know you mentioned that these are being recorded, and they're are they available somewhere, or are they going to be sent out?
I can make it available.
Okay.
Once it's once I download it from the, after it like finishes rendering in the cloud, I can download it, and I can have someone on our team upload it to YouTube, and I can send out a link. Would that work?
Yes, yes, yes.
Cool. Cool.
That was awesome, John.
Yeah. John, this is a different topic, but it's one that I thought would be good to also just mention here. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you found out today about carb scoping and where that stuff is at?
Oh yeah, yeah. So the carb scoping workshops have begun. They started this week. There was 2 yesterday, 2 today, and 2 tomorrow. So it's kind of a 3-day thing. Let me just pull up what those were. Quick workshops. Yeah. So the one yesterday, or yeah, actually it was just one yesterday. That was basically the introductory workshop for the whole scoping plan update that went over multiple bills that influenced the process. The ones today, this morning, were natural and working lands focus, and then equity and environmental justice in the afternoon. And then tomorrow, which I've signed up to go to both of these, they're on the transportation and electricity sectors. So transportation will be in the morning, and electricity will be in the afternoon. And public comments are still open for the workshop yesterday, as well as for the 2 today. So there's still opportunity for us to provide comment if we so choose. And that's, I think they're closing at the end of the day today. So if, it's a little last minute notice. I'm signed up for I get about, more than a dozen emails from Carb a week, but for some reason they didn't send me an update that they had scheduled these workshops, but I'm going to be monitoring these more closely from now on because those email updates don't seem to work. But yeah, so that process has started. And it looks like there was a good few presentations yesterday, something like 10 to 14 presentations.
Cool. All right, and they're recording those, and we can have someone watch the proceedings?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah. I'll have to check, but they at least have the presentations up on the website.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right on. John, thank you.
Yeah.
Just a quick note. We didn't do this last week. We did it this week because of the timing. We wanted to sort of have this workshop before the budget process got too far along. I think we're not going to do one next week unless you had something already prepared.
No.
So the next time it'll be 3 weeks from now. We'll end up doing another one of these.
Okay.
But Lori and Eliana, I will be in touch with the two of you before then. Once we have our job posting ready, and I would love to just have convos with both of you, pick your brains on networks to get it out in, or even if you know some specific people you think might be good candidates, would love to chat with you about that. Cool.
Yeah, you got it.
Awesome. Okay. Oh, and I'm going to get Tatanka to send you invites to the Circle of 100 that meets on Wednesday.
Awesome. Thank
Okay.
you. Thanks, gentlemen.
Right.